I am Harlan Pierce, 70 years old, and my son threw a glass of ice water in my face because I asked for a second piece of chicken. He wanted to impress his wealthy in-laws. He wanted to break my spirit. He forgot I still held the master administrative access to the multi-million-dollar business I built for him. I did not scream. I wiped my face, packed a single bag, emptied every operational account, and booked a one-way ticket to Belize. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to teach a hard lesson to a family member who underestimated your worth. The ice water hit my face before I even registered his hand moving. The freezing shock stole the breath directly from my lungs. The heavy crystal glass slammed against the mahogany dining table with a violent thud. I bought that exact table for them 3 years ago as a housewarming gift. "You eat what you are given, old man," my son Damon shouted. His voice echoed off the vaulted ceilings of his suburban Chicago mansion. I sat perfectly still. The freezing water dripped from my chin onto the collar of my only good button-down shirt. Across the expansive table, Megan and her affluent parents stared at me with thinly veiled disgust. Her father adjusted his designer silk tie. Her mother looked away, pretending the uncomfortable display of cruelty had not just occurred. They were the guests of honor tonight. I was simply the dark blemish in their pristine, white, high society world. I looked down at my plate. A meager scoop of dry white rice and a single, pale chicken wing sat in the center of the fine china. I had politely asked if there was any extra meat in the kitchen. That simple request triggered the violent assault. Damon stood over me, his chest heaving with misplaced anger. His tailored suit jacket stretched tight across his shoulders. He wanted to humiliate me in front of his wealthy white in-laws to prove he was the absolute master of his domain. He needed them to know I was entirely beneath him. He wanted to erase the fact that my hard work paid for the very roof over his head. Megan did not flinch at the sudden violence. My daughter-in-law simply took a delicate sip of her expensive Chardonnay. Her pale, perfectly manicured hand reached out and rested on Damon's arm. It was an unmistakable gesture of approval. "Damon is under immense stress at the fitness centers, Harlan," she said. Her tone was sharp and entirely devoid of warmth. "Groceries are expensive. We cannot afford your massive appetite. You need to learn your place in this house." I wiped the freezing water from my eyes. I looked at the extravagant spread of roasted lamb and expensive side dishes placed exclusively at their end of the table. I thought about my ruined knees. I worked 45 grueling years as a structural engineer and heavy machinery mechanic in the South Side rail yards. I broke my body lifting steel and pouring concrete so Damon would never have to struggle as a black man in this country. I handed him my entire life savings of $400,000 in hard cash to open his luxury fitness franchise. I gave him the solid foundation for his entire empire. Now his entitled wife was telling me I was bleeding them dry over a piece of chicken. I looked at Damon. He stared back with cold, arrogant eyes. There was no trace of the boy I raised. He had traded his soul for country club memberships and the approval of a family that would never truly accept him. He chose his new life over the father who gave him everything. I did not yell. I did not curse them or remind them of my sacrifices. Anger is a useless emotion when dealing with predators. I picked up my cloth napkin. I meticulously wiped the water from my face and hands. I folded the napkin into a perfect square and placed it neatly beside my plate. I pushed my chair back, stood up with the quiet dignity I had cultivated over 7 decades, and walked away. The grand foyer of their mansion boasted imported Italian marble floors and a sweeping staircase. It was designed to showcase limitless wealth and intimidate anyone who entered. I walked past the opulence and headed down the narrow back hallway. They forced me to live in the former storage closet behind the laundry room. It was cramped, unheated, and completely windowless. A thin mattress sat on a rusty metal frame pushed against the cold wall. The stark contrast between their vaulted ceilings and my concrete cell was entirely intentional. It was a calculated psychological tactic designed to break my spirit over time. They wanted me to feel utterly worthless. They wanted me to beg for scraps so they could feel powerful and magnanimous. I stepped into my freezing room and closed the heavy wooden door behind me. I reached for the brass locking mechanism to secure my small sanctuary. I turned the lock, but the heavy brass handle fell off completely in my hand. It hit the concrete floor with a loud metallic clatter. I inspected the doorframe. The screws had been deliberately stripped and removed from the wood. Megan had intentionally destroyed the lock while I was out walking earlier that afternoon. She had stripped away my last remaining ounce of privacy and safety. A harsh, freezing clarity washed over me in that dark room. I was not a guest in my son's house. I was a prisoner being systematically starved and broken down. I pushed my heavy wooden dresser across the bare floor and wedged it tightly against the doorframe. The physical exertion strained my chest, but I refused to remain vulnerable in enemy territory. I sat on the edge of the thin mattress and opened my old battered laptop. Damon assumed I was a technologically illiterate old mechanic who barely knew how to check his email. He assumed I spent my days reading newspapers and taking walks around the block. He forgot one crucial detail from 3 years ago. I legally demanded my name remain as the primary guarantor on the master corporate banking accounts for the franchise. I logged into the secure financial portal. I needed to see exactly what my son was doing with my life's work. My chest heaved with tight, shallow gasps as I sat on the edge of the thin mattress. Shoving that solid oak dresser across the uneven concrete floor demanded a physical toll my 70-year-old heart was not prepared to pay. A sharp burning sensation radiated down my left arm and settled deep within my shoulder. I leaned heavily against the cold, cinder-block wall and forced myself to take slow, measured breaths until the erratic pounding in my chest subsided. The air in this windowless storage room was stagnant and freezing. Damon and Megan intentionally kept the heating vents closed in this section of the house to save money. I wrapped a frayed wool blanket tightly around my shoulders to stop my body from shivering. Looking at the heavy furniture wedged firmly against the broken doorframe, a profound realization settled over me. I was no longer a father seeking refuge in his son's home. I was a hostage barricading himself against his own blood. They deliberately removed that locking mechanism to strip away my fundamental human dignity. They wanted me in a constant state of anxiety, knowing they could intrude upon my space at any given moment. They believed that physical intimidation and constant disrespect would gradually erode my willpower until I submitted to their absolute control. They wanted me to surrender my independence and fade quietly into the background of their luxurious lives. They severely miscalculated my endurance. I survived 45 brutal Chicago winters repairing diesel engines and managing structural loads in the open rail yards. I survived corporate layoffs, union strikes, and the sudden death of my wife. A broken door handle and a plate of dry rice were not going to defeat me. I refused to play the role of the helpless victim they desperately wanted me to be. The glowing screen of my battered laptop illuminated the dark room, casting sharp shadows against the concrete walls. Damon viewed me as a relic of a bygone era. My son frequently mocked my calloused hands and work boots, entirely convinced that my lack of a formal business degree equated to sheer ignorance. He genuinely believed my understanding of the world ended at heavy machinery and manual labor. He assumed I spent my isolated hours aimlessly browsing the internet or sleeping. He severely underestimated the intellect required to manage complex engineering schematics and municipal rail budgets. More importantly, he failed to comprehend that analyzing a corporate balance sheet uses the exact same logical framework as diagnosing a catastrophic engine failure. I navigated past the basic consumer login portal and inputted my master credentials into the encrypted commercial gateway. The two-factor authentication prompt appeared instantly on the screen. Years ago, I discreetly linked the secondary security verification to an old untraceable prepaid phone I kept hidden in the bottom of my canvas duffel bag. The device vibrated silently in my pocket. I typed the 6-digit access code and hit enter. the loading screen vanished, revealing the unfiltered financial nervous system of Damon's entire fitness empire. He never realized that maintaining my title as primary guarantor granted me unrestricted top-tier administrative access to the entire corporate banking infrastructure. I had the power to view every single cent that moved through his company. I adjusted my reading glasses and began to dismantle his financial facade piece by piece. The master dashboard populated with a cascade of green and red figures. I immediately bypassed the superficial front-end graphics designed to show daily gym attendance and membership renewals. I dug straight into the raw operational ledgers. The immediate data confirmed what I already suspected regarding the franchise's popularity in the city. The 3 luxury gym locations were performing exceptionally well. Monthly membership dues and personal training packages were generating massive, consistent revenue. The corporate accounts should have been overflowing with healthy profit margins and robust liquid reserves. Instead, the primary operating account balance sat at a terrifyingly low number. The business was generating millions in gross revenue, yet the liquid capital was almost entirely depleted. The digital ledger painted a clear picture of a company bleeding out from a severed artery. I scrutinized the payroll accounts, the commercial lease payments, and the equipment maintenance logs to rule out legitimate business expenses. The standard overhead costs were perfectly aligned with the projected business models I had approved 3 years ago. There were no sudden spikes in vendor costs or unexpected tax liabilities. The gyms were highly profitable on paper, but the actual cash was vanishing before it could ever reach the corporate reserve accounts. My heart hammered against my ribs this time, not from physical exertion, but from a rising tide of calculated dread. My son was not just a terrible money manager. He was actively draining the lifeblood of the company I sacrificed my knees to build. I opened the detailed transaction history for the past 12 months. I exported the raw data into a custom spreadsheet, filtering the thousands of lines of code to isolate any transaction exceeding $10,000. I needed to see exactly where the missing capital was flowing. The filtered spreadsheet revealed a devastating systematic pattern of wealth extraction. Every Thursday morning at exactly 9 o'clock, a massive manual wire transfer was executed from the primary corporate holding account. These were not automated vendor payments or scheduled payroll distributions. They were direct specialized authorizations requiring Damon's personal digital signature. I tracked the outbound capital with cold precision. $50,000 sent in the first week of November. $80,000 wired in the second week of December. $120,000 transferred just 3 days before Christmas. The sheer volume of the missing funds was staggering. I highlighted the routing numbers and the receiving financial institution. Damon was not sending this money to fitness equipment suppliers or local marketing firms. He was funneling my life savings into a completely unknown external entity. The recipient listed on every single fraudulent wire transfer was a private commercial account designated only as Apex Solutions. There were no invoices attached to the transfers. There were no service contracts linked to the payments. It was a blatant, unapologetic corporate hemorrhage. The nature of the conflict instantly shifted within my mind. This was no longer a domestic dispute about a broken lock or a disrespectful daughter-in-law. This was not about an arrogant son trying to impress his wealthy white in-laws at a dinner party. This was active, calculated embezzlement. Damon was committing severe financial crimes using the exact infrastructure I funded. He was stripping the company bare, leaving me exposed to massive financial liabilities and federal scrutiny as the primary guarantor. I stared at the glowing screen as the freezing temperature of the room faded into the background. The betrayal was absolute. I had to uncover the true identity behind Apex Solutions. I stared at the sterile white glow of the spreadsheet, my eyes burning from the harsh screen. The name Apex Solutions sat there like a parasite embedded deep within my corporate infrastructure. I needed undeniable proof before I made my next move. I opened the back-end authorization logs to trace the digital fingerprints of every single wire transfer. I pulled the specific metadata for the $50,000 transaction from November and the $80,000 transfer from December. The banking system securely recorded the exact Internet Protocol addresses and device identifiers used to approve the outgoing funds. Every single transfer was initiated directly from Damon's personal smartphone or his primary office computer. My son was not the unfortunate victim of a sophisticated corporate hack or an external phishing scam. He was the sole architect of his own company's destruction. I pressed the screen capture command on my laptop, documenting the routing numbers, the timestamps, and Damon's encrypted digital signature. I created a secure folder on my desktop and began dropping the screenshots inside. I was building a solid, unbreakable chain of evidence. I treated the financial ledger exactly like a compromised steel beam on a heavy suspension bridge. You do not just patch the visible crack. You trace the structural failure back to the absolute source to prevent a catastrophic collapse. Damon was funneling hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the operational reserves, bypassing the standard payroll and vendor pipelines. He was deliberately bleeding the franchise dry. But Damon was a man obsessed with his own public image designer suits and luxury vehicles. He did not possess the financial discipline to hide this much cash in a sophisticated offshore account. He was sending the capital to someone else. I minimized the banking portal and opened a secure browser window. I needed to unmask the ghost draining my life's work. I navigated to the official Illinois Secretary of State Corporate Registry database. Decades of managing complex municipal contracts in the rail yards had taught me exactly how to hunt down shadowy subcontractors and hidden corporate entities. I typed Apex Solutions into the search bar and hit enter. The database returned a dozen results, but only one matched the specific commercial routing codes from the wire transfers. I paid the nominal state fee to download the unredacted corporate formation documents. The large document materialized on my screen. Apex Solutions was not a legitimate fitness equipment manufacturer. It was not a specialized marketing firm or a commercial real estate holding company. It was registered as a vague, generalized technology consulting firm. The business address listed on the official state charter was not a commercial corporate plaza. It was a luxury residential condominium in a highly gentrified neighborhood downtown. I scrolled past the boilerplate legal jargon directly to the bottom of the document to locate the managing partners. Shell companies always use registered agents to hide the true owners, but arrogant criminals almost always leave a careless trail of paperwork. The initial filing documentation required a wet signature from the sole managing director. I zoomed in heavily on the scanned signature block. The cursive letters were frantic and sloppy but perfectly legible. The sole registered proprietor of Apex Solutions was a man named Logan. The pieces of the puzzle slammed together with a sickening, violent force. My breath caught in my throat. I stared at the name until the letters began to blur together. Logan was Megan's younger brother. He was a 30-year-old man with a notorious history of failed cryptocurrency scams and pending civil lawsuits. I had met him precisely twice at family gatherings, where he spent the entire evening loudly pitching fraudulent investment schemes to anyone forced to listen. Megan's affluent white family constantly enabled his destructive behavior, treating his repeated financial crimes as mere youthful indiscretions. Now Damon was actively bankrolling him. The ultimate devastating truth crystallized in my mind. Damon was not stealing my money to build a secret nest egg for his own future. He was deliberately draining the legacy I built with my bare, bleeding hands to finance his white brother-in-law's fraudulent lifestyle. He was committing severe federal wire fraud to buy the approval of a family that secretly despised him. Damon wanted so desperately to be accepted by Megan's high society parents that he was willing to sacrifice his own father to fund their golden child. He traded the blood and sweat of a black man who gave him everything for a seat at a table where he would always be considered a guest. A profound, icy rage replaced the initial shock of the betrayal. Damon had turned my lifetime of sacrifice into a limitless cash machine for a known con artist. I saved the corporate registry documents directly into the encrypted folder alongside the wire transfer receipts. I had definitively proved the embezzlement. I had identified the exact destination of the stolen capital. I was ready to formulate a strict legal strategy to sever the financial artery completely. I reached for the mouse to close the browser windows and shut down the laptop. Before my finger could click the trackpad, my hidden prepaid cell phone vibrated violently against the concrete floor. The sudden harsh buzz echoed loudly in the cramped storage room. I quickly grabbed the device to silence the alarm, ensuring the noise did not travel down the hallway to where Damon and Megan were sleeping. The screen illuminated the darkness with a stark red notification banner. It was an urgent automated text message from my primary healthcare provider. I opened the alert immediately. The message stated that my premium health insurance policy had been abruptly canceled, effective immediately, due to non-payment. A cold spike of genuine panic pierced my chest. When I suffered a mild cardiac event last year, Damon convinced me to grant him temporary control over my small monthly retirement pension, to handle my basic utility and medical bills while I recovered. I trusted my son to manage the meager funds that kept me alive. He had stopped paying my medical insurance completely. I require a very specific, highly expensive cardiovascular medication to keep my heart functioning properly and prevent another attack. My prescription was due for a vital refill the very next morning. Damon was not just starving me out of the house with dry rice. He was actively cutting off my access to the medicine keeping me alive. The financial betrayal had just morphed into an immediate physical threat to my life. The sharp pain in my chest served as a brutal reminder of my immediate reality. My heart medication was not a luxury. It was the only barrier keeping me from a fatal cardiac event. I needed that refill by morning. I dressed in my thickest wool coat and wrapped a scarf tightly around my neck. Damon had confiscated the keys to my reliable sedan 6 months ago, claiming my reflexes were too slow for city driving. He sold the vehicle 2 days later and pocketed the cash. I stepped out of the suffocating mansion and into the unforgiving Chicago winter. The wind howled off Lake Michigan, cutting through my layers of clothing like a jagged knife. I walked 3 miles down the icy, unsalted suburban sidewalks. Every step sent a jolt of agony through my ruined knees. The freezing air burned my lungs, forcing me to stop twice to catch my breath against a frozen brick wall. I refused to let the physical pain break my focus. I focused entirely on placing one heavy boot in front of the other. I watched the luxury cars speed past me on the road, their heated interiors a stark contrast to my bitter trek. I finally pushed through the heavy glass doors of the local pharmacy, my hands completely numb and my face raw from the biting wind. The bright fluorescent lights overhead illuminated the exhausted lines on my face reflected in the sliding glass doors. I walked directly to the prescription counter and handed the technician my empty plastic bottle. I expected a simple refill. I expected to return to the house and finalize my legal strategy against Damon. I did not expect the final safety net of my life to dissolve right in front of me. The head pharmacist, a kind woman named Sarah, who had filled my prescriptions for 5 years, typed my information into her computer. Her warm smile vanished instantly. She looked at her screen, typed the numbers again, and let out a heavy sigh. She leaned across the counter and spoke in a quiet, apologetic tone. She informed me that my primary health insurance provider had actively rejected the billing claim. The system flagged my account as suspended for extreme delinquency. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I asked her for the out-of-pocket cost to cover a single month of the medication. Sarah looked at me with genuine pity and stated the total was $800. The pharmaceutical companies held a monopoly on the specific compound, keeping my heart beating. I reached into my leather wallet and pulled out my personal debit card. This card was directly linked to the small municipal pension I earned from 45 years in the rail yards. It was my private survival fund, completely separate from the massive corporate franchise accounts. I handed the card to Sarah and instructed her to run the full amount. She swiped the plastic through the terminal. The machine beeped loudly. A harsh red message flashed across the digital display. The transaction was declined. I told her to run it a second time, assuming a minor network error. She processed the card again. The machine issued the exact same rejection. The line of customers behind me began to shift impatiently. The humiliation burned the back of my neck. I asked Sarah to hold the medication behind the counter while I checked my funds. I stepped away from the busy counter and walked to a quiet corner near the waiting area. I pulled out my smartphone and opened my personal banking application. I inputted my passcode and waited for the screen to load. I expected to see the familiar cushion of my hard-earned pension savings. The screen rendered a number that stole the remaining breath from my lungs. My available checking balance was exactly $0.00. My savings account reflected the identical terrifying digit. I opened the recent transaction history. Over the past 3 weeks, massive internal transfers had siphoned every single penny out of my personal accounts. Damon had not just neglected my medical insurance premiums. He had actively invaded my private retirement funds. He drained my personal survival money to temporarily plug the massive corporate deficit he created by funding Logan's fraudulent shell companies. He stole the money meant to keep my heart beating to finance his white brother-in-law's criminal lifestyle. I closed the application and slid the phone back into my coat pocket. I looked back at the pharmacy counter. Sarah held the small white paper bag containing the pills I desperately needed. I could not buy them. I had absolutely nothing. I turned my back on the pharmacy counter and walked out the sliding glass doors into the freezing night. The 3-mile walk back to the mansion felt twice as long. The bitter wind whipped against my face, but the cold weather paled in comparison to the absolute ice forming in my veins. My son had crossed the final boundary. He was actively destroying my physical ability to survive. I entered the mansion through the back door. The intense heat of the house hit my frozen face. I found Damon standing in the lavish kitchen pouring himself a glass of expensive bourbon. Megan sat at the marble island idly scrolling through a luxury vacation website on her tablet. I walked directly up to my son. I stated clearly that my pension accounts were completely empty and my medication was denied. Damon took a slow sip of his bourbon. He did not display a single ounce of guilt. He coldly replied that the business required immediate emergency liquidity. He told me to stop complaining, find a bus route, and visit a free public clinic in the city if I felt sick. The utter disregard for my life hung heavily in the warm air. I stepped closer to him, demanding he return my pension funds by morning. My sudden movement startled Megan. She jumped back in her high bar stool. Her elbow caught a thick stack of paperwork resting on the edge of the marble island. The documents tumbled to the hardwood floor, sliding across the polished surface directly to my boots. I looked down. The top manila folder rested face up under the bright kitchen pendant lights. The bold black text printed across the cover was impossible to miss. It read, "Petition for involuntary medical conservatorship." The financial betrayal had just evolved into a calculated legal trap designed to erase my existence entirely. The bold black letters printed on the thick manila folder seared themselves into my memory. Petition for involuntary medical conservatorship. Megan scrambled off her high bar stool, her expensive designer heels slipping on the polished hardwood floor. Her manicured nails scraped desperately against the wood as she lunged to snatch the documents away from my heavy boots. She was simply not fast enough. My eyes had already processed the exposed top page. I spent my entire adult career reading dense municipal blueprints in poorly lit construction trailers. I could dissect a complex legal brief in a matter of seconds. The primary petitioner was clearly listed as Damon Pierce. The designated medical professional was a private specialist named Dr. Arthur Hemlock. The preliminary diagnostic justification printed in stark red ink read, "Aggressive dementia with violent tendencies." My own son was actively building a fabricated airtight legal case to prove I was losing my mind. Damon stepped forward, his jaw tight, trying to physically intimidate me into silence. He puffed out his chest and demanded I go back to my room and stop spying on his private business matters. I did not flinch. I did not ask him to explain the horrific betrayal I had just witnessed. I simply turned my back on both of them and walked down the narrow hallway to my freezing storage room. I pushed the heavy oak dresser back against the broken doorframe to secure my perimeter. My mind raced past the initial emotional devastation and shifted entirely into a cold, analytical survival mode. A conservatorship was not just a profound personal insult. It was a highly tactical weapon designed for absolute financial annihilation. I sat on the edge of my thin mattress and pieced their legal puzzle together with terrifying clarity. A medical conservatorship would strip me of every fundamental human right I possessed. If this Dr. Hemlock successfully certified me as mentally incompetent, the state of Illinois would grant Damon absolute legal authority over my life, my medical decisions, and my assets. He would gain the immediate power to legally remove my name from the franchise guarantor documents without my consent. I would lose my top-tier administrative access to the corporate banking portals. I would be locked out of my own business forever. Damon could then drain the remaining liquid capital, continue funding his white brother-in-law's fraudulent shell companies, and face absolutely no federal oversight. My signature would become entirely worthless. Once the legal transfer of power was finalized, Damon and Megan would not keep me in this cramped guest room. They would forcibly relocate me to a bleak, state-run psychiatric facility where no one would ever listen to my accusations of embezzlement. They needed me declared legally insane to ensure my future testimony against their financial crimes would be permanently dismissed. My warnings to the authorities would be treated as the paranoid ramblings of a sick, declining old man. They were effectively planning to bury me alive to cover their tracks. They wanted to steal my legacy and erase my voice in a single devastating legal maneuver. I pressed my ear against the cold cinder-block wall separating my room from the main hallway. The pristine acoustics of the massive house carried their voices perfectly through the drywall. I heard the sharp clinking of crystal glasses. Damon and Megan were pouring fresh bourbon, actively celebrating their impending victory. Megan let out a sharp, arrogant laugh. She praised Damon for finding a private doctor willing to sign the evaluation paperwork for a simple cash bribe. She complained that having me in the house was ruining her social aesthetic, claiming her wealthy friends were asking too many questions about the old man living in the back hallway. Damon confidently assured her the nightmare would be over by the weekend. He stated that Dr. Hemlock was officially scheduled to arrive at the mansion in exactly 72 hours to conduct the mandatory in-home cognitive assessment. Once the corrupt doctor signed the affidavit on Friday morning, Damon would file the expedited injunction with a sympathetic family court judge by Friday afternoon. The timeline crashed down on me with a terrifying weight. I had exactly 3 days before the trap snapped shut permanently. 72 hours before I lost my freedom, my mind, and my hard-earned legacy. I sat back down on the freezing mattress. I knew I could not fight a medical injunction through the standard legal channels without access to my pension funds. I could not hire an attorney with $0 in my checking account. I needed a specialized, highly aggressive countermeasure. I needed absolute financial firepower to break their siege. I waited in the freezing darkness until the digital clock on my laptop read exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. The sprawling suburban mansion finally fell dead silent. I changed into my darkest clothing, layering 2 heavy black sweaters to shield my aging body against the biting Chicago wind. I carefully slid the heavy oak dresser away from the door, just enough to create an emergency exit path, but I did not dare walk through the main house. Damon had installed a sophisticated motion sensor security system in the front rooms, and I could not risk triggering the alarm. I moved to the small, narrow ventilation window near the ceiling of the storage room wall. I unlatched the rusty lock, pushed the glass pane open, and pulled myself up. My ruined knees screamed in absolute agony as I squeezed through the tight frame and dropped heavily down into the snow-covered bushes outside. The freezing air hit my lungs instantly, turning my breath to white smoke. I ignored the intense physical pain. I navigated through the deep shadows of the manicured lawn and walked briskly toward the main road. I needed to reach the downtown financial district before sunrise. I was heading to see the only man in the entire city ruthless enough to dismantle Damon's corporate structure. I was going to find Bradley Cole. Bradley was a brilliant forensic accountant who owed his entire university education to a quiet loan I gave his father 30 years ago. If anyone could help me navigate the digital minefield Damon had constructed, it was him. I marched down the frozen street, the icy wind biting at my exposed cheeks. Every painful step forward was fueled by a singular, unyielding purpose. Damon thought he could erase me. He thought he could steal the fruits of my labor and cast me aside like broken machinery. He was about to learn a brutal lesson about the foundations I build. They do not crumble easily, and they never collapse without taking the architect's enemies down with them. The brutal Chicago wind pushed against my back as I navigated the deserted downtown streets. The towering glass and steel structures of the financial district rose into the freezing night sky like icy monoliths. My ruined knees ached with every step, protesting the 3-mile trek from the suburbs, but my mind was operating with lethal clarity. I stood outside a sleek 70-story high-rise. The revolving doors were locked, but a stern security guard sat at the front desk. I tapped on the glass. He opened a side panel and asked for my identification. I told him I was there to see Bradley Cole. The guard checked a digital ledger, raised his eyebrows at the late hour, and swiped a keycard to grant me access. I rode the silent high-speed elevator to the 42nd floor. The polished oak doors of Cole Financial Forensics stood open. Bradley Cole was a ruthless corporate accountant who dissected billion-dollar bankruptcies for a living. He was also the son of my late best friend, a man who worked the same grueling rail yard shifts I did until his lungs gave out. When Bradley's father passed away 30 years ago, the bank moved to foreclose on their modest home and derail Bradley's university acceptance. I quietly paid the mortgage and funded his entire tuition in cash. I never asked for a single cent in return. Bradley never forgot the sacrifice that built his empire. I walked into his expansive corner office overlooking the glittering city grid. He sat behind a massive mahogany desk, reviewing digital contracts on 3 glowing monitors. He wore a sharp, tailored navy suit despite the late hour. He looked up, removed his wire-rimmed glasses, and immediately stood. He did not ask why a 70-year-old man was standing in his office at 3 a.m. He simply walked over, shook my hand firmly, and asked who we needed to destroy. I sat in the plush leather chair opposite his desk and opened my canvas duffel bag. I pulled out the thick stack of printed financial ledgers I had meticulously compiled from the corporate banking portal. I laid the documents flat across the polished wood, smoothing out the creased edges with my calloused hands. I placed the screenshots of the wire transfers right in the center, ensuring the routing numbers were perfectly visible. I explained the entire situation with cold, mechanical precision. I detailed the $50,000 and $80,000 unauthorized withdrawals draining the business. I showed him the state registry documents proving the money was flowing directly into a shell company controlled by Logan, my white daughter-in-law's criminal brother. I watched Bradley's eyes scan the printed routing codes and the fraudulent corporate filings. His jaw tightened. The professional detachment vanished, replaced by a deep, vibrating disgust. I then explained the final, lethal component of their strategy. I described the manila folder sitting on the kitchen island, containing the petition for an involuntary medical conservatorship. I explained their plan to hire a corrupt private psychiatrist to declare me legally incompetent by the end of the week. Bradley leaned back in his chair and exhaled sharply. He confirmed that Damon was executing a textbook corporate bleed. He validated every single one of my financial conclusions without hesitation. Damon was systematically committing severe federal wire fraud while actively weaponizing the family court system to silence the only witness. Bradley tapped his expensive pen against the mahogany desk, his mind racing through the legal architecture of the crimes. He stated that the level of betrayal was staggering, even for the cutthroat corporate world he navigated daily. My son had constructed a perfect financial murder. A heavy silence settled over the expansive office as the gravity of the situation crystallized. I demanded we contact the federal authorities immediately to report the embezzlement and arrest Damon. Bradley shook his head, his expression turning grim. He explained the harsh, unforgiving reality of the American justice system. Reporting a multi-million-dollar wire fraud to the police would instantly trigger a massive federal investigation. The authorities would secure a court order to freeze every single corporate and personal account linked to the franchise while they gathered evidence. The litigation process would drag through the federal courts for a minimum of 3 to 5 years. During that agonizingly slow legal battle, I would remain entirely penniless. I would have absolutely zero access to my original capital or my pension. The lack of financial resources would leave me completely defenseless against the impending medical conservatorship. Damon and his high-priced lawyers would use my lack of funds and my pending police reports to convince a judge that I required state-appointed guardianship. They would frame my accusations as paranoid delusions caused by dementia. They would lock me in a psychiatric ward long before the embezzlement trial ever saw a jury. We could not rely on the slow grind of the criminal justice system to save my life. The ticking clock of the corrupt psychiatrist gave us less than 72 hours to maneuver. Bradley stood up and paced across the length of his office. He stated that we needed a significantly faster, strictly financial execution. We needed a strategy that bypassed the courts and struck directly at the operational liquidity of the fitness franchise. We had to sever Damon's access to the money before he could sever my access to my freedom. Bradley returned to his desk and began furiously typing on his primary monitor. He accessed a secure, cloud-based legal archive and pulled up the original franchise operating agreement I signed 3 years ago. It was the master contract that established the corporate hierarchy and my position as the primary seed investor. Bradley expanded the digital document, scrolling rapidly through 70 pages of dense boilerplate legal jargon. He bypassed the standard operational clauses and focused entirely on the section detailing capital investments and guarantor rights. His eyes darted back and forth across the glowing screen as he analyzed the fine print. Suddenly, he stopped scrolling. A slow, predatory smile spread across his face. He highlighted a single, deeply buried paragraph near the bottom of the financial addendum. He turned the large monitor around so I could read the text clearly. Bradley explained that most investors blindly sign standard agreements that lock their money into the corporate structure indefinitely. But because I had demanded my name remain on the master banking charter as the sole guarantor, this specific contract contained a highly unusual provision. He pointed to the highlighted text. He told me he had found a brutal, undeniable legal loophole that completely inverted the power dynamic. It was a contractual failsafe designed for ultimate financial protection, and Damon had been too arrogant to ever read the fine print. Bradley looked me directly in the eyes and told me we were going to drain my son's empire dry by morning. Bradley turned his large, high-resolution monitor toward me. He pointed a steady finger at a dense paragraph buried deep within the financial addendum of the original franchise operating agreement. He explained that 3 years ago, when I strictly demanded my name remain on the master banking charter as the sole guarantor, the corporate lawyers inserted a highly specific contingency protocol. It was a fail-safe clause designed exclusively for venture capitalists to protect their initial seed money. As the primary capital investor, if I uncovered documented evidence of gross financial mismanagement or active embezzlement, I retained the unilateral legal right to aggressively protect my stake. I held the absolute power to withdraw my original investment, alongside all accrued compounding interest, directly from the corporate operational accounts. I did not need a judge to issue a slow court order. I did not need to file a formal police report that would freeze the assets in legal limbo. Most importantly, I did not need Damon to authorize the transaction in any capacity. The digital signature of the primary guarantor was the ultimate trump card. Bradley looked at the screenshots of the wire transfers to Logan's shell company. He confirmed that Damon's blatant funneling of corporate cash constituted severe financial mismanagement under every metric of Illinois corporate law. The evidence I meticulously collected from the digital ledger was more than enough to satisfy the bank's internal compliance department. The failsafe was fully active and ready to be weaponized. I leaned forward in the plush leather chair, feeling the crushing weight of the ticking clock lift slightly from my chest. We had found a direct surgical method to completely bypass the agonizingly slow legal system. We could strike Damon precisely where his entire arrogant identity lived. Bradley opened a proprietary financial calculator program on his secondary monitor. His fingers flew across the mechanical keyboard, importing the live figures from the franchise ledgers I had provided. He aggregated my initial $400,000 cash injection with 3 years of aggressive compounded corporate interest and the specific guarantor dividends outlined in the failsafe parameters. He hit the final execution key. The total sum illuminated the screen in stark green digits. $2.4 million. Bradley leaned back in his chair and explained the brutal reality of that specific number. Taking that exact amount would not just hurt the luxury fitness franchise. It would trigger an instantaneous, catastrophic financial hemorrhage. It would instantly drain the company's operational liquidity down to absolute zero. The commercial gym locations generated massive revenue, but Damon lived far beyond his means, intentionally hoarding zero cash reserves to fund his lavish lifestyle. If I pulled the $2.4 million, the corporate checking accounts would instantly run dry. The automatic clearinghouse payments for the massive commercial leases would bounce by Monday morning. The direct debit accounts for the high-end exercise equipment suppliers would fail simultaneously. The resulting financial shockwave would trigger immediate default clauses across all their lucrative vendor contracts. Damon and Megan would be plunged into total, irreversible corporate bankruptcy within 48 hours. Their luxury vehicles, their designer clothing, and their sprawling suburban mansion were all built on the fragile illusion of constant cash flow. I was going to shut off the valve completely. I stared at the massive number on the screen. It represented 45 years of my blood and sweat in the rail yards. It was my legacy, and I was going to take it back. A heavy, calculating silence settled over the sleek downtown office. Bradley folded his hands on the mahogany desk and shattered the brief moment of victory. He explained that extracting $2.4 million in a single unilateral digital maneuver automatically triggered the bank's highest tier of security protocols. The corporate banking infrastructure would not simply release that extreme volume of capital based on my master password alone. The system demanded a rigorous secondary verification to prevent catastrophic corporate fraud. When Bradley initiated the massive withdrawal from his secure terminal, the bank would immediately deploy a time-sensitive two-factor authentication code. That specific 6-digit security key would be sent directly to the primary communication device registered on the corporate charter. The text message would go straight to Damon's personal smartphone. My son kept that device glued to his hand at all hours of the day. If Damon saw the massive withdrawal notification and the security code flash across his screen, he would instantly realize the franchise accounts were under a targeted attack. He would immediately lock down the network, call the fraud department, to freeze all outbound transfers and ruthlessly accelerate the medical conservatorship process to silence me. We could not bypass this digital hurdle from the outside. Bradley could prepare the complex routing architecture mask, the destination offshore accounts, and bypass the front-end security, but he absolutely needed that 6-digit authentication code to finalize the execution. The entire financial retaliation hinged on intercepting a single text message before Damon could read the alert. I processed the tactical roadblock with cold efficiency. The digital barrier required a strictly physical solution. Bradley locked his piercing eyes on mine. He stated clearly that he needed me inside the mansion, positioned squarely beside my son when the transfer sequence initiated. I had to physically steal Damon's smartphone, secure the authentication code, and relay it back to Bradley within a rigid 60-second verification window. I had to accomplish this highly delicate maneuver without triggering a single ounce of suspicion from a man actively plotting to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward. I stood up from the leather chair. The excruciating pain in my knees from the 3-mile walk through the freezing wind had completely vanished, replaced entirely by pure, refined adrenaline. I told Bradley to prepare the offshore trust accounts and stand by for my signal. I knew exactly when to strike. Damon and Megan were expecting their corrupt private psychiatrist to arrive at the mansion in less than 48 hours to conduct the fraudulent cognitive assessment. They would be entirely focused on orchestrating my mental downfall. They would be arrogant, highly distracted, and overly confident in their perceived victory over an old man. I would use their own malicious trap as my perfect cover. I zipped my canvas duffel bag closed and turned toward the polished oak doors. The plan was irrevocably set in motion. I had to walk back into the lion's den, play the pathetic role of the broken, declining father, and pickpocket my ruthless son while he actively signed my life away. I slipped back through the narrow ventilation window of the storage room just as the first gray light of dawn broke over the Chicago suburbs. My shoulders burned with sharp, stinging exhaustion. I dropped onto the freezing concrete floor, biting my lip to suppress a loud groan as my ruined knees absorbed the heavy impact. I pushed the heavy oak dresser back into place against the broken doorframe and collapsed onto the thin mattress. I did not sleep for a single second. I lay in the dark, regulating my breathing, preparing my mind for the psychological warfare scheduled for that morning. The heavy, aggressive knock on my barricaded door came at exactly 9 o'clock. Damon demanded I come out to the living room immediately. I dragged the dresser aside and emerged into the blinding natural light of the grand foyer. Dr. Arthur Hemlock was waiting patiently on the expensive leather sofa. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a forced, practiced smile that did not reach his cold, calculating eyes. He carried a sleek leather briefcase containing the legal documents designed to end my freedom. Damon and Megan stood directly behind his chair, hovering like vultures waiting for a carcass to drop. Megan crossed her arms tightly, tapping her designer heel against the hardwood floor in a blatant display of annoyance. Damon stared at me with pure, unadulterated malice. They positioned themselves strategically to intimidate me. They wanted me nervous and flustered. They expected me to fight back aggressively. An angry outburst would only validate the violent tendencies box checked on Hemlock's fraudulent evaluation form. I refused to give them the reaction they anticipated. I shuffled slowly toward the armchair opposite the doctor, letting my shoulders slump forward. I adopted the posture of a completely defeated man. Dr. Hemlock opened his briefcase and pulled out a thick stack of cognitive assessment worksheets. He spoke to me in a slow, patronizing tone, the exact cadence reserved for toddlers and the severely impaired. He asked me to state my full name, my date of birth, and the current year. I deployed my performance with absolute mechanical precision. I answered the first 2 questions correctly, then hesitated deliberately on the year. I let my eyes wander toward the vaulted ceiling, staring blankly at an ornate light fixture. I mumbled an incorrect date from a decade ago, shifting my gaze to Damon with the perfectly manufactured expression of deep vulnerability. Damon's chest puffed out instantly. A distinct, arrogant smirk spread across his face. He thrived on the illusion of my weakness. Dr. Hemlock held up a piece of paper featuring a simple drawing of a blank clock face and asked me to identify the current time. I took the paper with trembling hands. I intentionally gripped the pen awkwardly between my knuckles. I drew a jagged, completely incorrect line, feigning a severe motor tremor in my wrist. When Hemlock pointed to Megan and asked me to identify my daughter-in-law, I squinted hard. I stuttered heavily, calling her by the name of my late wife. Megan rolled her eyes in performative exasperation, but I saw the triumphant, greedy gleam in her expression. I stroked Damon's monumental ego by repeatedly apologizing for my confusion and begging for his patience. I acted entirely submissive. I portrayed a broken, declining old man desperate for his son's guidance and protection. I reverse-engineered the exact symptoms of cognitive decay I knew Hemlock needed for his fabricated affidavit. My mind was sharper than anyone else in that room, actively analyzing their micro-expressions and confirming their blind arrogance. They bought the illusion entirely. Dr. Hemlock clicked his expensive pen and neatly stacked the assessment papers on the glass table. He looked up at Damon and offered a solemn, highly theatrical nod of confirmation. He stated clearly that the cognitive decline was severely advanced and required immediate legal intervention for my own physical safety. He pulled the final affidavit of incompetence from his leather briefcase and placed it flat on the coffee table for signature. Damon practically vibrated with euphoria. The grueling, visible tension in his shoulders evaporated instantly. He believed the ultimate victory was completely secured. He believed he had successfully stolen my business and condemned me to a state psychiatric ward without a single remaining obstacle. The suffocating atmosphere in the massive living room shifted instantly from aggressive intimidation to relaxed celebration. Damon instructed Megan to grab the fine crystal flutes from the dining room cabinet. He walked briskly over to the sprawling marble kitchen island to retrieve a bottle of expensive champagne he had chilling in the refrigerator. In his profound, unearned arrogance, he committed the single fatal operational error I desperately needed. Damon pulled his primary smartphone from his suit pocket to check a notification from his bank. He set the unlocked device down flat on the edge of the marble counter. He turned his back to the island, entirely focused on popping the cork of the champagne bottle to toast the corrupt doctor. He assumed his power was absolute in this house. He assumed the broken old man sitting quietly in the armchair posed absolutely zero threat to his expanding empire. I seized the opening the exact second the cork popped loudly against the ceiling. I placed my hands on the armrests of my chair and pushed myself up with a shaky, exaggerated groan. I hunched my shoulders and shuffled awkwardly toward the hallway leading to the back rooms. Damon glanced over his shoulder, the foaming champagne bottle gripped in his hand. I mumbled incoherently about needing to use the restroom due to a weak bladder. I kept my eyes fixed on the floorboards, portraying a man consumed by total physical humiliation. Damon laughed, a harsh, cruel sound, and waved me away dismissively. He turned his attention back to pouring the sparkling wine for Hemlock and Megan. They clinked their glasses together in the center of the room, celebrating my engineered demise. I walked slowly past the marble kitchen island. The moment my body shielded the counter from their line of sight, the frail old man vanished completely. My right hand, trained by decades of manipulating intricate, high-voltage engine components in the dark, moved with blinding lethal speed. I swiped Damon's smartphone off the marble surface and slid it seamlessly into the deep pocket of my wool sweater, in one fluid, continuous motion. I did not break my shuffling stride for a fraction of a second. I walked directly into the first-floor guest bathroom and pulled the heavy solid wood door shut. I engaged the deadbolt with a firm, satisfying click. I pulled Damon's phone from my pocket. The screen was bright and still unlocked. I reached into my other pocket and retrieved my hidden prepaid device. I opened the encrypted messaging application and selected Bradley's secure contact number. I typed 2 letters. Go. I hit send. The digital trap was fully armed. I stood perfectly still inside the guest bathroom. The heavy solid wood door formed a temporary barrier between my calculated silence and the arrogant celebration happening in the grand foyer. My mechanic's hands gripped Damon's sleek smartphone. The device felt foreign and dangerously slippery against my calloused palms. Every single second that ticked by felt like an agonizing hour. I stared at the dark screen, waiting for the bank's automated system to generate the 2-factor authentication code. Bradley needed time to initiate the massive withdrawal from his secure terminal downtown, but the window for execution was violently narrow. If the screen remained dark for too long, the entire operation would collapse. A sudden sharp noise pierced through the thick door. The clinking of crystal champagne flutes ceased entirely. I heard heavy footsteps marching down the hardwood hallway. Damon was moving with aggressive, impatient strides. His voice echoed through the corridor, demanding to know where he had left his device. He cursed loudly, blaming Megan for moving his things while he was pouring the drinks. The tension in my chest tightened like a coiled industrial spring. He was retracing his steps back toward the kitchen island. If he realized the phone was missing and suspected me, he would violently force his way into this bathroom. He would discover my secondary phone, and the entire financial ambush would be exposed. I regulated my breathing, drawing deep air into my lungs to steady my pulse. I needed to remain an invisible, broken old man for just 2 more minutes. I pressed my thumb against the edge of the stolen device, praying the corporate banking network would act with absolute efficiency. The smartphone vibrated sharply against my palm. The screen suddenly illuminated the dim bathroom with a bright, glaring light. A banner notification dropped down from the top edge of the glass. It was the automated alert from the Master Commercial Bank. The message contained a stern security warning, followed by a bold 6-digit numeric key. I did not possess the luxury of writing the numbers down on paper. I locked my eyes onto the screen and burned the sequence directly into my memory, using the exact same mental discipline I utilized to memorize complex structural blueprints in the rail yards. 842917. I repeated the sequence twice in my head to ensure absolute accuracy. I quickly pulled my hidden prepaid device from my coat pocket and opened the encrypted messaging thread with Bradley. My thick thumbs struck the small digital keys with rapid, flawless precision. I hit send and watched the message mark as delivered. The true danger laid in the digital footprint. I immediately turned my attention back to Damon's smartphone. I swiped down to open the notification center and tapped directly into his messaging application. I found the automated banking thread, swiped left across the specific alert, and hit the delete command. The text message vanished instantly, leaving absolutely zero trace of the security intercept. I cleared the background applications and pressed the power button, plunging the screen back into total darkness. Outside the bathroom door, Damon's heavy footsteps grew noticeably louder. He was shouting at Megan, swearing he had left the device sitting right next to the champagne bucket. The physical interception was flawless, but the financial execution was entirely in Bradley's hands now. My hidden phone buzzed with a single encrypted reply from Bradley. The message contained only one word: cleared. A profound, overwhelming wave of vindication washed over me. $2.4 million had just successfully vanished from the franchise operational accounts. My original capital investment, along with 3 years of aggressively compounded interest, was now safely diverted into an impenetrable offshore trust registered exclusively in my name. The financial artery feeding Damon's arrogant empire was permanently severed. I slid my prepaid phone deep into my pocket and unlocked the bathroom door. I pushed the heavy wood open and shuffled back out into the bright hallway. I hunched my shoulders forward, immediately slipping back into the role of the confused, declining old man. Damon was furiously tearing apart the living room cushions, barking orders at the corrupt psychiatrist to help him search. I moved with slow, deliberate steps toward the grand foyer. I passed a decorative mahogany side table positioned near the main entryway. With a smooth, practiced flick of my wrist, I dropped his smartphone onto the polished surface. The device landed silently next to a silver decorative tray. I cleared my throat and mumbled loudly about needing a glass of water. Damon spun around, his face red with frustration. He marched toward me, demanding to know if I had touched his things. Before he could unleash a barrage of insults, his eyes landed on the side table. He snatched the phone up with a heavy sigh of relief, muttering about his own forgetfulness. He did not possess a single ounce of suspicion. He had absolutely no idea that the device he was holding was completely disconnected from the wealth he thought he controlled. The capital was legally secured, But the intricate architecture of commercial banking provided me with a temporary vital shield. A unilateral withdrawal of that extreme magnitude required a mandatory 24-hour processing window to clear the final ledger updates across the domestic network. The front-end interface on Damon's banking application would continue to display a robust, healthy balance until the automated clearinghouse fully finalized the transaction the following morning. For the next 24 hours, Damon and Megan were completely unaware that they were entirely bankrupt. The corrupt psychiatrist finished his champagne and packed his fraudulent evaluation papers into his leather briefcase, assuring my son the conservatorship would be filed by Friday. Damon shook his hand, radiating the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he had won everything. Megan stepped forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute vanity. She loudly clapped her hands together to command the room. She announced that to celebrate their upcoming total corporate control, they were moving forward with their massive high society charity gala scheduled for the very next evening. She bragged about the luxury caterers, the local politicians, and the affluent investors she had invited to showcase their expanding empire. She wanted the entire city to witness their manufactured success. I stood quietly in the corner staring at the floorboards. They were throwing a lavish, exorbitant party funded by accounts that no longer existed. The stage was perfectly set for their catastrophic public destruction. The following evening, the sprawling suburban mansion transformed into a blinding spectacle of unearned excess. A fleet of luxury vehicles choked the long, circular driveway, managed by a frantic team of hired valets in crisp white shirts. A classical string quartet played aggressively in the grand foyer, fighting to be heard over the deafening roar of affluent chatter. The house was packed to the walls with local politicians, eager real estate developers, and wealthy investors. Damon and Megan paraded through the center of the crowd like conquering royalty. Damon wore a bespoke velvet tuxedo that cost more than I made in 3 months at the rail yards. He held a crystal glass of top-tier bourbon, laughing loudly at jokes made by city council members. He pointed toward the massive bay windows, openly bragging about his aggressive plans to open 5 new luxury fitness locations by the end of the fiscal quarter. Megan floated beside him in a shimmering silver designer gown, her neck heavy with diamonds purchased directly with my stolen capital. She flagged down the hired luxury caterers, snapping her fingers impatiently to demand fresh trays of expensive caviar and imported champagne for her guests. They projected an impenetrable aura of infinite wealth and absolute corporate dominance. They demanded the entire city witness their meteoric rise to the top of the social hierarchy. I stood silently in the dark hallway, leading to my cramped storage room, watching the grotesque display unfold with clinical detachment. They were dancing on the deck of a sinking ship, completely oblivious to the massive hole torn through the hull. Every drop of expensive wine poured and every exorbitant appetizer served was billed directly to corporate accounts that were currently holding absolute zero balances. The sheer scale of their public arrogance was breathtaking. I shifted my gaze toward the expansive backyard patio where the true parasite of my legacy held court. Megan's younger brother Logan stood directly beside a massive glowing ice sculpture carved intricately into the shape of the franchise logo. He wore an ill-fitting white linen suit and held a thick cigar in his right hand. A small circle of naive, wealthy investors surrounded him. I watched his animated gestures as he loudly boasted about his revolutionary new technology startup. He brazenly claimed to possess exclusive proprietary software guaranteed to disrupt the entire commercial logistics industry. He slapped Damon hard on the shoulder as my son walked past, proudly announcing to the crowd that his brilliant brother-in-law was the primary angel investor funding his visionary enterprise. Damon beamed with pride, soaking up the unearned admiration of Megan's affluent white family. The sickening reality of the scene turned my stomach. Logan was a known fraudster, with a highly public trail of bankruptcies and ruined business partnerships. He possessed no software and no actual company. He simply possessed the audacity to ask for money and my desperate approval-seeking son handed him hundreds of thousands of dollars without a single second of hesitation. I watched the two men toast their shared success under the expensive patio heaters. I felt absolutely no anger. The fiery rage that consumed me days earlier had completely solidified into a cold, unbreakable layer of frost. I observed them with the detached mechanical precision of an engineer inspecting a condemned building moments before the demolition charges detonate. They were loudly celebrating a fabricated empire constructed entirely on a foundation of severe federal wire fraud. I stepped back into the deep shadows of the hallway and turned away from the blinding lights of the gala. The chaotic, deafening noise of the high society party provided the perfect acoustic cover for my final preparations. I walked into the freezing windowless storage room and locked the broken door with a heavy wooden chair for the very last time. I pulled my faded canvas duffel bag from beneath the thin mattress. I did not possess many physical belongings in this house. Damon and Megan had systematically stripped away my personal possessions over the past 3 years, claiming my aesthetic did not match their modern interior decor. I packed 2 heavy wool sweaters, 3 pairs of durable work pants, and a small stack of faded photographs featuring my late wife. I rolled my heavy leather work boots and placed them at the very bottom of the bag. These were the exact steel-toed boots I wore when I poured the massive concrete foundations for the city transit system. They were a highly tactile reminder of the literal blood and sweat that generated the millions of dollars currently shifting across international borders. I swept my hands across the bare dresser and the small metal nightstand. I ensured I left absolutely no trace of my existence in this miserable concrete cell. I wanted the room to look as empty and sterile as the hearts of the people throwing the lavish party outside. I pulled the heavy zipper of the duffel bag closed with a sharp, definitive pull. My entire life now fit easily over my right shoulder. The physical weight of the bag grounded me, but my spirit felt lighter than it had in a decade. I was finally ready to sever the toxic bloodline forever. I sat on the edge of the bare mattress and waited for the final digital confirmation. The dark room suddenly illuminated with a harsh, piercing blue light. My hidden prepaid smartphone vibrated violently against my calloused palm. The encrypted messaging application displayed a single urgent notification from Bradley Cole. I opened the secure thread with bated breath. Bradley did not waste valuable time with pleasantries or unnecessary exposition. He delivered the final devastating tactical update. The international routing sequence had successfully completed its mandatory security cycles. The massive offshore transfer had officially bypassed the commercial clearinghouse protocols without triggering a single internal banking alarm. $2.4 million was now permanently locked inside an impenetrable decentralized trust account registered exclusively in the nation of Belize. The domestic business ledgers had simultaneously refreshed across the entire financial network to reflect the colossal withdrawal. Every single operational account linked to Damon's luxury fitness franchise was currently sitting at an absolute zero balance. The corporate credit lines were entirely frozen by the banking algorithms. The financial bomb I carefully planted in the center of my son's empire was now fully armed and actively counting down to inevitable detonation. I read the message a second time to solidify the reality of the victory. I typed a brief confirmation of receipt to Bradley and instructed him to dispatch the extraction vehicle to the designated pickup point. I deleted the encrypted messaging application from the device completely to eliminate any digital trail. I stood up and slung the heavy canvas strap of the duffel bag over my shoulder. The thumping bass of the party music rattled the drywall of the storage room. Damon and Megan were still dancing, completely unaware that their entire world had just been legally and financially erased. It was time for me to walk out the front door. The heavy canvas strap of my duffel bag dug into my collarbone as I stepped out of the freezing storage room for the absolute last time. I walked down the long shadowed hallway and entered the sprawling kitchen. The pristine white marble gleamed under the recessed pendant lights. Through the massive floor-to-ceiling glass doors, The charity gala roared on the backyard patio. The muffled, heavy bass of the hired band vibrated against the double-paned glass. I watched the silhouettes of local politicians and wealthy developers laughing, their hands clutching expensive crystal champagne flutes I had unknowingly paid for. Damon stood at the center of the crowd. He wore his tailored velvet tuxedo, throwing his head back in a booming, arrogant laugh, as Megan's brother Logan handed him a freshly lit cigar. They looked invincible. They looked like royalty presiding over an endless empire. I shifted my gaze away from the glass and looked at the grand mahogany dining table dominating the adjacent room. It was the exact same table where Damon had thrown the freezing ice water directly into my face just days earlier. I traced my calloused thumb over the polished wood edge. I had purchased that table for them as a housewarming gift, using the overtime pay I earned repairing structural collapses in the brutal Chicago rail yards. I poured my literal blood into the wood of this house, and they treated me like a stray dog begging for scraps. The stinging memory of the dry rice and the single chicken wing flashed through my mind, but it brought absolutely no anger. I felt nothing but a profound clinical detachment. The architectural foundation of their entire reality was already demolished. They just had not felt the building drop yet. I walked over to the massive kitchen island. The sleek, untouched marble surface was entirely devoid of clutter, meticulously staged by Megan to project a minimalist high society aesthetic. I reached into the front pocket of my heavy wool coat and pulled out a single plain white envelope. I laid it perfectly in the dead center of the island, aligning the edges with the geometric grain of the stone. I did not write a dramatic farewell letter. I did not leave a desperate plea for understanding or a fatherly lecture on morality. The contents of the envelope communicated the finality of my judgment with absolute lethal precision. Inside rested a crisp printed screenshot of the master corporate banking portal. The primary operational ledger clearly displayed a devastating balance of $0 and 0 cents. Tucked directly beneath the screenshot was the official banking confirmation of the international wire transfer, proving the $2.4 million was irrevocably locked inside an offshore trust in Belize. I made sure to include one final highly specific document. I printed the current municipal bus schedule for the local county transit authority. I used a bright red marker to circle the exact route leading from their wealthy suburban subdivision directly to the downtown homeless shelter. Damon had callously instructed me to take a bus to a free public clinic when he cut off my vital heart medication. I was simply returning the exact same level of compassion he offered his own flesh and blood. The envelope was a perfect silent executioner. It represented the total eradication of his financial fraud. I pressed my hand flat against the paper one last time to ensure it would not move. My business in this house was permanently concluded. I turned my back on the glowing kitchen and walked briskly toward the grand foyer. The string quartet playing near the coat check did not even notice the elderly black man slipping past the marble columns with a faded duffel bag. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped out into the freezing Chicago night. The bitter wind immediately bit at my cheeks, but the cold felt incredibly refreshing. I walked down the long circular driveway, bypassing the chaotic line of luxury vehicles waiting for the valet attendants. At the very end of the street, parked discreetly under the amber glow of a broken street lamp, sat an idling black town car. The rear door swung open as I approached. Bradley Cole sat in the back seat, illuminated entirely by the blue glow of his encrypted laptop screen. I tossed my bag into the trunk and slid into the leather seat beside the brilliant forensic accountant. Bradley closed his laptop with a sharp snap. He looked at me, his sharp eyes scanning my face for any sign of hesitation or regret. He found absolutely none. I gave him a single definitive nod. Bradley tapped the glass partition separating us from the driver. He gave the command to head straight to the international terminal. The heavy town car pulled smoothly away from the curb. I looked out the tinted window and watched Damon's sprawling, illuminated mansion shrink into the distance. The blinding party lights and the arrogant laughter faded into the dark suburban landscape. I did not look back a second time. The toxic prison that had systematically suffocated my dignity was officially behind me. I was moving forward toward a horizon they could never reach. The journey to O'Hare International Airport passed in a comfortable, calculated silence. Bradley utilized his elite corporate concierge access to bypass the chaotic security lines. Within 30 minutes, I was sitting comfortably in the leather seat of a first-class cabin bound directly for Belize City. I accepted a warm towel from the flight attendant and ordered a glass of premium bourbon. The heavy gripping pain in my chest that had plagued me for the past 6 months completely dissolved. The commercial jet pushed back from the gate and taxied toward the primary runway. The massive engines roared to life, pressing my shoulders deep into the plush seat. As the wheels severed contact with the frozen Chicago tarmac, launching me into the dark sky toward absolute freedom, the digital timer on my financial ambush hit 0. Miles below me, back at the opulent suburban mansion, the luxury catering director approached Damon on the crowded patio. The man held an urgent digital invoice tablet in his hand, politely requesting the final $20,000 payment for the evening's exorbitant food and alcohol. Damon reached into his tailored velvet tuxedo jacket with supreme arrogance. He pulled out the sleek, heavy metal corporate platinum card. He handed it over to the caterer, expecting the transaction to process with the usual invisible efficiency of limitless wealth. The caterer swiped the metal card through the wireless terminal. The machine emitted a sharp, loud beep that cut directly through the nearby music. The screen flashed a bright red error message. The first devastating wave of the financial collapse had officially breached the gala. While I sat at 30,000 feet flying over the dark expanse of the Gulf of Mexico, the intricate gears of my financial trap began to grind my son's empire into dust. Bradley had already tapped into the local vendor payment networks to monitor the immediate fallout. He would later feed me the exact, highly satisfying details of the execution. I knew the precise schedule of Megan's extravagant charity gala. At exactly 10 o'clock in the evening, the head caterer would seek out the host to settle the final invoice. Damon stood near the massive outdoor fire pit on the back patio, holding court with a circle of wealthy real estate developers. He wore his tailored velvet tuxedo and his unearned arrogance like a protective shield. The head caterer, a stern man in a crisp black uniform, approached my son, holding a wireless digital payment tablet. The total bill for the imported caviar, the premium champagne, and the extensive staffing came to exactly $20,000. Damon did not excuse himself to handle the massive transaction in private. He saw a golden opportunity to perform. He wanted the affluent investors to witness his casual dismissal of such a staggering expense. Damon reached into the inner pocket of his jacket and pulled out the heavy, solid metal corporate platinum card. He handed the card to the caterer with a loud theatrical sigh, making a boastful joke about the high cost of keeping his beautiful wife happy. He expected the developers to chuckle and admire his limitless liquidity. He expected the transaction to process with the invisible, frictionless efficiency reserved exclusively for the ultra-wealthy. He expected to remain the absolute king of his fabricated suburban castle. The caterer slid the heavy metal card into the wireless terminal. The catering machine processed the encrypted data for 3 long, agonizing seconds. A sharp, loud, discordant beep cut directly through the ambient jazz music floating across the illuminated patio. The digital screen flashed a bright red error message. Declined. Damon did not immediately panic. He possessed too much pride to show weakness in front of his wealthy peers. He maintained his smooth, polished facade with practiced ease. He let out a dismissive laugh loudly, assuring the watching developers that his commercial bank frequently placed security holds on his accounts due to the sheer volume of his daily corporate expenditures. He reached back into his tuxedo pocket and retrieved a second corporate credit card. This was a prestigious gold-tier account reserved strictly for emergency operational liquidity. He handed it to the caterer with a tight, forced smile. The caterer swiped the second card through the terminal, with a rigid, unimpressed expression. The machine emitted the exact same loud, offensive beep. The screen flashed the identical red rejection warning. The polite, subservient demeanor of the head caterer vanished entirely. High-end event vendors dealt with wealthy clients daily, and they despised nothing more than a flashy host attempting to bounce a massive bill at the end of a grueling shift. The caterer raised his voice, demanding an immediate viable form of payment in certified funds. The loud, aggressive tone shattered the sophisticated atmosphere of the patio. The surrounding developers, local politicians, and affluent socialites stopped their conversations entirely. They turned their heads to watch the wealthy fitness mogul publicly fail to pay for his own extravagant party. The whispers started instantly. The impenetrable armor of Damon's high society image sustained its first massive visible structural crack. He stood frozen under the patio heaters, staring blankly at the useless plastic in his hands. Megan noticed the escalating commotion from across the sprawling yard. She abandoned her conversation with a local city councilman and rushed over to intervene. Her silver designer gown shimmered under the patio lights as she aggressively pushed her way through the crowd of whispering guests. She loudly scolded the caterer for causing a scene at a high society charity event. She demanded he lower his voice and show some respect to his employers. Damon stood completely paralyzed, his face draining of all color, as the mathematical impossibility of the situation began to set in. Megan scoffed at her husband's apparent incompetence. She opened her designer clutch and pulled out her exclusive personal black card. She loudly announced that she would simply cover the trivial expense herself, attempting to salvage their rapidly deteriorating public dignity. She snatched the digital terminal from the caterer's hands and aggressively inserted the microchip. She expected her limitless spending power to immediately silence the murmuring crowd. The terminal processed her black card. The screen did not simply flash a standard decline message. The digital display illuminated with two devastating, undeniable words: insufficient funds. Megan's personal card was directly linked to the franchise's master operational accounts to automatically fund her luxurious lifestyle. My extraction of the $2.4 million had drained her personal checking with the exact same ruthless efficiency. Megan stared at the bright red letters in absolute horror. The whispers among the affluent guests grew into a loud, undeniable chorus of brutal judgment. The luxurious facade they had spent 3 years building completely disintegrated in a matter of seconds. The wealthy elite physically took a step back from them. They were exposed as absolute frauds in front of the exact people they desperately wanted to impress. The head caterer loudly threatened to lock the front gates and call the local police for grand theft of services. Damon could not breathe. The suffocating weight of absolute financial ruin crushed his lungs like a collapsed concrete beam. He abandoned his wife on the patio, shoved past the judging politicians, and sprinted blindly into the house. He needed to reach his private banker immediately to fix the catastrophic error. He burst into the pristine, brightly lit kitchen, his hands shaking violently as he searched the countertops for his smartphone. He stopped dead in his tracks. A single plain white envelope sat perfectly centered on the massive marble island. Damon recognized my meticulous mechanical precision immediately. He tore the envelope open with frantic, trembling fingers. He pulled out the documents. He stared at the printed screenshot of the master corporate banking portal displaying a balance of absolute zero. He read the official banking confirmation of the irreversible international wire transfer. He realized his father had not simply walked away in defeat. I had systematically dismantled the entire foundation of his universe. Damon looked at the final piece of paper inside the envelope. It was a printed schedule for the municipal bus route leading directly to the downtown homeless shelter. The sheer magnitude of his defeat struck him like a physical blow. The engineering was flawless. Damon's knees buckled entirely. He collapsed heavily against the marble counter, clutching his chest, gasping desperately for air in a massive mansion he could no longer afford. Bradley monitored the immediate fallout through his extensive network of financial contacts and fed me every satisfying detail of my son's collapse. Back in the pristine kitchen of the suburban mansion, Damon stood paralyzed against the marble island. He finally processed the empty room and the printed bus schedule. He realized I had not merely gone to sleep. I had completely vanished into the night, taking the lifeblood of his arrogant empire with me. The head caterer did not afford my son the luxury of a private breakdown. The stern man marched directly into the kitchen, flanked by two massive private security guards hired specifically for the gala. He cornered Damon against the expensive stainless steel refrigerator. The caterer flatly stated that if a certified wire transfer or a cashier's check was not produced in the next 10 minutes, he would summon the local police to arrest Damon for grand theft of services. Damon possessed zero liquid capital. He had no hidden cash reserves to access. The suffocating reality forced him into the most humiliating action of his entire life. He walked slowly back out to the illuminated patio. His shoulders were slumped forward. The tailored velvet tuxedo suddenly looked like a cheap, ill-fitting costume. He approached Megan's affluent white father, a man who had always looked at Damon with thinly veiled contempt. Damon swallowed the last remaining shreds of his pride. He quietly begged his father-in-law for a $20,000 emergency loan to pay the catering staff. The older man stared at Damon with absolute unvarnished disgust. He slowly pulled out a checkbook, wrote the requested amount, and shoved the paper aggressively against Damon's chest. The entire circle of wealthy real estate developers witnessed the pathetic transaction. Damon's carefully fabricated high society facade was thoroughly and permanently destroyed. The agonizing weekend stretched into a grueling nightmare of bounced transactions and frantic unanswered phone calls. Damon falsely assumed he could salvage the deteriorating situation when the commercial banks reopened on Monday. He believed he could simply walk into his flagship luxury gym, access the heavy emergency cash safe hidden in the manager's office, and utilize the daily membership revenue to patch the catastrophic holes in his corporate ledger. He drove his expensive sports car to the prime downtown location just before dawn. He parked illegally near the front entrance, desperate to assert his usual commanding authority. He marched up to the pristine floor-to-ceiling glass doors of his prized fitness center. He reached for the brushed steel handle. A heavy industrial chain wrapped tightly around the custom handles, secured by a massive steel padlock. Damon froze in his tracks. He pulled his master electronic keycard from his leather wallet and slapped it hard against the digital scanner mounted on the brick wall. The scanner emitted a harsh, flat rejection tone. The small indicator light flashed a solid, unforgiving red. He swiped the card a second time, striking the plastic against the sensor with mounting undeniable panic. The system remained entirely dead to his commands. The commercial property management company utilized a highly aggressive automated accounting system. When the massive monthly lease payment bounced hard on Friday night, the software automatically triggered an immediate default protocol. The ruthless landlord swiftly dispatched a private security team on Sunday evening to completely secure the premises. Damon rattled the chained glass doors like a trapped animal. He stared through the immaculate windows at the long rows of expensive exercise equipment he no longer legally controlled. He was entirely locked out of the very fortress he built using my stolen funds. Before Damon could fully process the reality of the chained doors, the deep guttural roar of heavy diesel engines echoed through the quiet morning streets. A convoy of massive commercial flatbed trucks turned aggressively into the parking lot. Damon watched in sheer horror as the heavy vehicles parked directly in front of his building. Men in thick work jackets leaped from the cabs carrying heavy clipboards and massive industrial bolt cutters. The national leasing companies that supplied the high-end treadmills, the imported weight racks, and the sophisticated biometric computer systems had received the exact same automated default notifications. They did not grant grace periods to bankrupt fraudulent clients. The lead repossession agent marched directly up to the glass doors and ordered his crew to cut the heavy chains. Damon stepped forward, shouting loudly that he was the owner, and demanding they leave his property immediately. The agent shoved a thick stack of official breach of contract documents directly into Damon's chest, legally and physically dismissing his false authority. As the heavy bolt cutters snapped the steel padlocks, the morning shift employees began to arrive in the parking lot. A dozen personal trainers, receptionists, and janitorial staff walked up to the chaotic, unfolding scene. They saw the ruthless repossession crews dragging the expensive equipment out through the loading dock doors. The employees immediately surrounded Damon. They aggressively demanded their missing Friday paychecks. The automatic direct deposit transfers had failed over the weekend, leaving the hard-working staff completely unpaid. They shouted furious obscenities, physically trapping Damon against the cold brick wall of the building. He had absolutely no answers and absolutely no money to offer the dedicated people whose daily labor he had so casually exploited. Damon violently shoved his way through the angry mob of betrayed employees. He sprinted back to his sports car, locked the heavy doors, and rapidly dialed the direct emergency line for the corporate banking legal department. He screamed hysterically into the phone, demanding they immediately reverse the fraudulent withdrawal executed by his father. He frantically claimed I was a declining, incompetent old man who had illegally hacked the financial system. The senior legal representative on the other end of the line did not offer a single ounce of sympathy. The banker spoke with freezing, mechanical detachment. He coldly informed Damon that Harlan Pierce held absolute unilateral legal authority to move those specific funds under the primary guarantor failsafe clause. The monumental transaction was meticulously documented, legally sound, and entirely irreversible. Damon begged the banker to release a temporary emergency line of credit to stop the repossession crews currently emptying his flagship gym. The representative delivered the final fatal blow to Damon's fragile, collapsing universe. The banker explained that a sudden unilateral withdrawal of $2.4 million automatically triggered a mandatory compliance protocol within the federal banking network. The sophisticated system flagged the master account for extreme irregular activity. A specialized team of federal financial auditors was currently examining the entire corporate ledger from top to bottom. They had already clearly identified the dozens of fraudulent wire transfers Damon had sent to Logan's non-existent shell companies. The bank officially severed all ties with the fitness franchise and turned the unredacted ledgers directly over to the federal authorities. Damon dropped the phone onto the passenger seat in absolute terror. Bradley possessed an uncanny ability to extract highly precise information from the chaos of a collapsing enterprise. He utilized his extensive network of financial contacts and local informants to monitor the immediate fallout, relaying the exact sequence of my son's domestic implosion over our secure encrypted connection. Damon sped away from the padlocked fitness center in a state of absolute blinding terror. He abandoned his expensive sports car diagonally across the manicured front lawn of the suburban estate and sprinted through the heavy double doors. He entered a literal war zone. The pristine architectural aesthetic of the grand foyer was completely destroyed. Megan had dragged 4 massive luxury suitcases down the sweeping mahogany staircase. They lay open across the imported Italian marble floors. She was frantically pulling expensive designer gowns, diamond jewelry boxes, and tight stacks of emergency cash from the hidden wall safes, hurling them violently into the luggage. The carefully constructed illusion of their perfect high society marriage evaporated the exact second the operational money vanished. Megan did not look up when Damon stumbled into the entryway gasping for breath. She did not offer comfort or formulate a unified strategy to face the impending federal crisis. She operated entirely on ruthless self-preservation. She ordered Damon to get out of her way and demanded the keys to the remaining luxury vehicle. Damon stared at his frantic wife in absolute shock. The woman who smiled brightly beside him at the charity gala just hours prior was now actively preparing to abandon him to the authorities. He realized immediately that her affection was entirely conditional, purchased, and maintained exclusively by my stolen capital. He stepped forward and kicked one of the heavy suitcases aggressively across the marble floor, effectively blocking her escape path. The pristine silence of the mansion shattered under the weight of their sudden mutual hatred. The confrontation escalated instantly into a vicious, violent screaming match that echoed through the empty vaulted ceilings. Damon pointed a trembling finger at his wife and roared his ultimate justification. He screamed that he had committed severe federal wire fraud for one singular purpose. He risked decades in a federal penitentiary exclusively to finance her useless, parasitic brother. He funneled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of the operational reserves because Megan constantly belittled his success and demanded he elevate her family's status. He blamed her endless vanity and her bottomless greed for the catastrophic corporate bleed. Megan did not retreat from his fury. She stood her ground and struck back with devastating, calculated precision. She completely stripped away the last remaining shreds of Damon's fragile ego. She mocked his gross incompetence and his desperate, pathetic need for her wealthy parents' approval. She screamed that he was an absolute fool for attempting a sophisticated corporate embezzlement scheme while leaving a seasoned, meticulous rail yard engineer on the master banking charter. She laughed maliciously at his profound arrogance. She told him he possessed the intellect of a child for assuming a grown man would simply sit in a freezing storage closet and allow himself to be starved into submission. Megan viciously reminded Damon that he handed the executioner the exact blade used to sever their empire. She weaponized his deepest insecurities, stating he was absolutely nothing without the solid foundation I had built for him. The argument stripped away their polite suburban veneer completely. They stood in the grand foyer screaming absolute vitriol, completely ignoring the fact that federal financial auditors were actively dissecting their digital crimes at that very moment. Damon demanded Megan use her family connections to rectify the disaster. He ordered her to retrieve the embezzled capital from Logan immediately. The terrifying reality of their situation finally breached Megan's arrogant exterior. She recognized that the local police and federal investigators would inevitably trace the stolen corporate funds directly to the Apex Solutions shell accounts. Her brother possessed the only remaining liquid capital capable of hiring elite defense attorneys to keep them out of federal prison. She dropped a handful of diamond necklaces onto the marble floor and snatched her smartphone from her designer purse. Her hands shook violently as she navigated to Logan's contact profile. She pressed the call button and raised the device to her ear, fully expecting her brother to answer the phone and deploy a miraculous bailout strategy. The line remained entirely silent for 2 agonizing seconds. A harsh, robotic, automated message interrupted the silence. The network operator flatly stated that the dialed number was disconnected or no longer in service. Megan pulled the phone away from her face, her eyes wide with sudden gripping panic. She aggressively mashed the redial button, holding the phone tightly against her ear. The exact same cold, mechanical voice repeated the disconnection warning. She navigated to a secondary encrypted messaging application they frequently used for private family communication. She sent a frantic barrage of text messages demanding Logan call her back immediately. Every single message bounced back with a stark red delivery failure notification. Logan had systematically severed every digital tether connecting him to the domestic cellular network. The color completely drained from Megan's face. The arrogant confidence she displayed while commanding luxury caterers the previous night vanished entirely. She looked at Damon with an expression of pure, unadulterated dread. She realized her brother had not just ignored her phone call. He had intentionally destroyed his communication lines to evade the impending federal fallout. Damon recognized the catastrophic implication of the dead phone line instantly. He shoved Megan aside and sprinted up the sweeping staircase toward his home office. He threw open his laptop and bypassed the standard login screens. During the initial setup of the fraudulent Apex Solutions shell company, Damon had insisted on maintaining administrative access to Logan's primary business email to monitor the inbound wire transfers. He utilized that backdoor access, now his fingers flying across the mechanical keyboard with desperate intensity. The inbox loaded onto the glowing monitor. Damon bypassed the spam and operational folders, digging directly into the recent travel confirmations. He found a single automated receipt from an international airline generated 12 hours prior. Damon clicked the digital document. His lungs stopped drawing air entirely. The screen displayed a confirmed first-class electronic ticket itinerary. Logan had booked a direct, one-way flight from Chicago O'Hare to Dubai. The timestamp proved her brother had boarded the massive commercial jet at the exact moment Damon and Megan were parading around their extravagant charity gala. Logan had leveraged the final $80,000 wire transfer to permanently flee the jurisdiction of the United States federal government. He took the embezzled capital and vanished into a country with notoriously complex extradition treaties. Damon stared blankly at the glowing screen. The ultimate betrayal crystallized in his mind. Logan had completely abandoned them to face the federal wire fraud indictments, the severe Internal Revenue Service audits, and the total asset liquidation entirely on their own. Damon possessed absolutely no money, no allies, and no viable escape route. The massive walls of his fabricated empire finally collapsed, burying him completely in the rubble. The humid, salt-heavy breeze of the Caribbean Sea swept across my private, sun-drenched balcony in Belize. I sat comfortably in a woven rattan chair, watching the brilliant turquoise waves crash rhythmically against the pristine white sand. The brutal, bone-chilling winds of the Chicago winter felt like a distant, faded nightmare. I took a slow, deliberate sip of premium dark-roasted local coffee from a heavy ceramic mug. The rich, bitter taste grounded me firmly in my new, triumphant reality. I held a brand-new, completely untraceable smartphone in my left hand. Bradley had meticulously orchestrated the secure communication line to ensure my exact geographical location remained completely cloaked from any domestic network intercepts. The dark screen illuminated suddenly, with a flashing encrypted alert. Bradley was establishing the secure connection from his high-rise office back in the frozen financial district. I accepted the inbound relay with a single tap. Bradley did not waste valuable time with pleasantries. He spoke with his usual clinical precision, informing me that the federal authorities were officially moving on the fitness franchise headquarters and the suburban mansion simultaneously. The inevitable collapse had reached its absolute climax. Bradley stated that a specific, desperate incoming call was waiting in the encrypted queue. He asked if I was prepared to hear the final, pathetic remnants of the empire I had just legally demolished. I took another sip of my coffee, feeling the warm, tropical sun bake the lingering, painful tension out of my ruined knees. I told Bradley to patch the connection through immediately. The line clicked twice as the sophisticated routing software scrambled the international signal. A heavy, ragged gasp echoed through the small speaker of my device. The sound of my son weeping uncontrollably poured through the encrypted connection. Damon was gasping desperately for air, his voice completely stripped of the arrogant high society polish he had weaponized against me for the past 3 years. He sounded exactly like a terrified, cornered animal facing the slaughterhouse. He screamed my name frantically into the receiver, begging me to speak to him, demanding to know where I had gone in the middle of the night. I maintained an absolute suffocating silence. The severe lack of a response fueled his sheer, unadulterated panic. Damon rapidly confessed that heavy transport trucks from the Internal Revenue Service were currently parked at the end of his sprawling circular driveway. Federal agents wearing tactical windbreakers were actively carrying heavy cardboard boxes of corporate financial records out the front doors of his massive suburban mansion. The government was permanently seizing the physical property to cover the catastrophic tax liabilities and the massive string of bounced vendor checks. He sobbed loudly, his words blurring together in a frantic, desperate rush of terrified adrenaline. Damon revealed that the Federal Bureau of Investigation had officially drafted severe criminal indictments for multiple counts of wire fraud and corporate embezzlement. The local authorities were preparing to issue immediate arrest warrants because Logan had vanished to Dubai with the stolen capital, leaving Damon holding the explosive bag. He begged me to access the offshore accounts and wire the $2.4 million back to the domestic ledger. He swore the massive cash injection would instantly satisfy the aggressive creditors and stop the federal prosecutors from filing the criminal charges. He pleaded with me to save his life, claiming he would not survive a decade in a federal penitentiary. He described the sheer terror of watching the repo men padlock his luxury vehicles while his wealthy white neighbors recorded the ultimate public humiliation on their smartphones. When the frantic updates regarding his absolute financial ruin failed to elicit a single word of sympathy from my end of the line, Damon abruptly shifted his strategy. He abandoned the corporate desperation and aggressively weaponized his biology. He attempted to manipulate the deep foundational bond between a father and a son to extract the stolen wealth. Damon dramatically lowered his voice, forcing a tone of profound, manufactured vulnerability. He swore to God that he loved me more than anything in the world. He claimed the crushing pressure of expanding the fitness franchise and constantly appeasing Megan's affluent parents had temporarily clouded his judgment and poisoned his mind. He promised he never actually intended to hurt me deliberately, framing the dry rice, the broken lock, and the freezing room as massive, regrettable misunderstandings blown entirely out of proportion. Damon aggressively leveraged the memory of his deceased mother. He cried out that she would be entirely devastated to see our family torn apart by a simple dispute over business capital. He begged for paternal mercy, swearing on his life that if I reversed the offshore transfer, he would immediately divorce Megan and dedicate the rest of his life to caring for me. He promised to buy me a beautiful house, hire the best private chefs, and ensure I received top-tier medical care for my cardiovascular condition. The promises flowed from his mouth like a rehearsed script designed specifically to exploit a lonely, vulnerable old man. He used the exact emotional cadence he deployed as a reckless teenager when he needed money to fix a wrecked car or cover a bounced rent check. He expected the deep, unconditional love of a black father who had sacrificed everything for his child to override basic logic and fundamental self-preservation. I sat comfortably in the woven rattan chair and listened to his elaborate, tearful performance in absolute silence. The rhythmic crashing of the turquoise waves against the Belizean shoreline provided a calm, steady counterpoint to his hysterical pleading. I analyzed every single word pouring out of the encrypted speaker. I dissected the structure of his frantic apologies with the same cold, mechanical precision I used to locate the fraudulent wire transfers in his corporate ledger. The devastating truth crystallized perfectly in my mind. Damon was not apologizing for the profound cruelty he inflicted upon me. He never mentioned the searing humiliation of the ice water hitting my face. He did not express a single ounce of guilt for actively plotting to lock me in a state-run psychiatric ward. He was entirely indifferent to the fact that he canceled my premium health insurance, effectively gambling with my physical survival to fund his vanity. Damon was exclusively terrified of the inescapable consequences rapidly closing in on him. His manufactured tears were solely for the permanent loss of his velvet tuxedos, his luxury vehicles, and his fabricated high society status. There was absolutely zero genuine remorse in his dark heart. He was simply a predator caught in a steel bear trap, chewing off his own leg to escape the approaching hunters. The final lingering traces of my paternal illusion evaporated completely into the warm, tropical breeze. I realized I owed this frantic, pathetic stranger absolutely nothing. The time for silent observation and data collection was officially over. I lowered the heavy ceramic coffee mug to the glass table and prepared to deliver his final, unyielding judgment. I placed my hand flat against the cool glass of the patio table. I allowed Damon to finish his frantic, tearful monologue without a single interruption. I let the silence stretch across the encrypted international line until his heavy, panicked breathing was the only sound remaining. Then I spoke. My voice was completely steady and devoid of any paternal warmth. I asked him if he remembered the exact temperature of the ice water he threw directly into my face. He stammered, entirely confused by the sudden shift in the conversation. I did not let him formulate an excuse. I described the sharp, freezing sensation of the water dripping down my collar, while he laughed with Megan's affluent white parents. I reminded him of the single dry chicken wing and the meager scoop of plain white rice sitting on my plate. I painted a perfectly clear, vivid picture of the broken brass handle on the windowless storage room door. I detailed how my ruined knees ached as I pushed a heavy oak dresser across a bare concrete floor, just to feel a fraction of safety inside my own son's house. I made absolutely certain he understood that my memory was flawless. I was not the declining, aggressive, dementia-ridden old man he tried to manufacture for his corrupt private psychiatrist. I was the exact same meticulous structural engineer who built the concrete foundation of his entire existence. His desperate sobs caught sharply in his throat. The terrifying realization hit him like a physical blow. He could not gaslight his way out of this execution. He was speaking to a man who saw right through his hollow soul. I did not allow the heavy silence to linger. I delivered the fundamental, inescapable truth of our situation. I explained that the original $400,000 was never a blank check for his unchecked arrogance. It was a highly specific sacred tool. I sacrificed my knees and my lower back in the freezing Chicago rail yards to forge that capital out of pure grit. I gave him that tool so he could build a secure, loving family and establish a generational legacy we could both be proud of. Instead, he used my sweat and blood to finance a fraudulent empire for his criminal brother-in-law. He weaponized my lifelong gift to buy the conditional approval of a high society world that fundamentally despised him. I stated clearly that a master builder never leaves his best tools in the hands of a reckless, destructive vandal. Since he made the conscious, calculated decision to destroy our family from the inside out, the initial tool was legally and permanently repossessed. He violently violated the core terms of our emotional contract. Therefore, the financial contract was unilaterally terminated. I informed him that I was not stealing his money. I was actively rescuing my hard-earned legacy from a burning building he intentionally set on fire. I told him he had traded the unwavering loyalty of a black father for the fleeting applause of people who would abandon him the second his credit cards declined. He had made his choice, and I was simply delivering the invoice. The polished, arrogant fitness mogul completely evaporated. Damon shattered into a million pathetic pieces. He shrieked into the encrypted line that the federal agents were currently locking the heavy iron gates to the suburban mansion. He screamed that his bank accounts were frozen, he possessed zero liquid cash, and his credit was entirely ruined. He cried out that he and Megan would be literally homeless by nightfall, with federal warrants hanging over their heads. His voice cracked as he begged on his hands and knees for just a fraction of the withdrawn capital to secure a basic apartment and a criminal defense attorney. I felt absolutely no pity. I responded with mechanical, lethal detachment. I reminded him of the plain white envelope I left perfectly centered on his pristine marble kitchen island. I advised him to look past the zero-balance bank statements and retrieve the printed municipal transit schedule. I told him the red circle marked the exact public bus route leading directly from his wealthy subdivision to the downtown county homeless shelter. I suggested he gather whatever designer clothing he could carry in his bare hands and start walking toward the bus stop before the authorities impounded his shoes. My final piece of advice was a direct, devastating echo of his own cruelty. I told him that when he arrived at the shelter and stood in the cafeteria line, he needed to keep his mouth shut, bow his head respectfully, and learn to eat exactly what he was given. A guttural, agonizing wail erupted from the small speaker of the device. It was the sound of a man plummeting headfirst into the absolute abyss of his own making. I did not wait to hear the rest of his total collapse. I pulled the smartphone away from my ear and pressed the red disconnect button. The encrypted call dropped instantly. The digital connection between us was formally severed, but I required absolute permanent closure. I popped the side panel of the untraceable device and extracted the tiny plastic SIM card. I held the small microchip between my calloused thumb and forefinger. I applied a brief, sharp pressure and snapped it completely in half. I picked up the glass of ice water resting on my patio table. I dropped the broken plastic pieces directly into the freezing liquid. I watched them sink past the ice cubes and settle quietly on the bottom of the glass. The severance was total, flawless, and irrevocable. Damon Pierce was officially dead to me. He was a ghost, haunting a frozen city I would never visit again. I leaned back in my woven rattan chair and turned my face toward the warm Caribbean sun. The violent, exhausting storm of the past 3 years had finally broken, leaving behind a clear, brilliant sky. I took a deep, steadying breath of the salt, heavy air. My new horizon was waiting, and for the first time in my life, I owed nothing to anyone. The humid Caribbean air carried the sharp, clean scent of roasted cocoa beans and salt water. I sat on the expansive wooden deck of my beachfront property, pouring a second cup of dark premium coffee for Bradley Cole. My brilliant forensic accountant had traded his tailored Chicago Navy suits for a lightweight linen shirt, though his dark eyes retained their usual lethal sharpness. He had flown into Belize City the previous evening to deliver the final, meticulously documented post-mortem of my son's fabricated empire. I did not ask for a sugar-coated summary. Bradley opened his leather portfolio and laid the official federal court dockets flat against the mahogany table. The indictments had come down with absolute, crushing severity. Damon and Megan were officially charged with multiple counts of aggressive wire fraud, corporate tax evasion, and conspiracy to commit financial embezzlement. The aggressive federal auditors had completely dismantled their luxurious facade, tracing every stolen dollar directly to Logan's abandoned offshore accounts. The commercial bank had officially foreclosed on the sprawling suburban mansion, auctioning off the imported Italian marble and vaulted ceilings to cover a fraction of the devastating debt. The luxury fitness franchise was entirely liquidated, the flagship locations stripped down to bare concrete and leased to a rival corporate conglomerate. Damon was currently navigating the federal justice system, relying entirely on an overworked public defender, his affluent white in-laws having immediately and permanently severed ties to avoid the radioactive fallout of the scandal. I looked at the stark black ink on the federal indictments. I searched my chest for a single ounce of paternal grief or lingering regret. I found absolutely nothing but the cool, refreshing certainty of a structural engineer who had successfully demolished a condemned building before it could collapse on innocent people. I left the legal documents sitting on the patio table and walked down the wooden stairs toward the vibrant heart of the local village. Bradley walked silently beside me, observing the profound physical transformation I had undergone over the past 6 months. The agonizing constant ache in my ruined knees had completely vanished, replaced by a steady, confident stride, fueled by the warm, tropical climate and absolute psychological liberation. I did not hoard the $2.4 million I had surgically extracted from Damon's bleeding ledgers. Hoarding capital was the exact toxic sickness that had infected and destroyed my son. Instead, I channeled a precise fraction of my reclaimed wealth into the surrounding community. We turned a corner past the local market, and the bright, freshly painted walls of a sprawling new building came into view. I had quietly purchased a neglected plot of commercial land and funded the rapid construction of a modern, fully equipped educational center and youth trade school. I hired local contractors, paying them premium, honest wages to pour the concrete foundations and frame the sturdy roofs. I was utilizing the exact same blue-collar engineering skills that had originally built Damon's empire, but I was applying them to soil that actually nurtured growth. I walked through the open courtyard of the facility, running my calloused hands along the solid brick pillars. I felt an overwhelming sense of pride that had been violently stripped from me in Chicago. I had successfully redirected the fruits of my lifelong labor away from funding vanity designer suits and fraudulent shell companies. I was actively planting seeds in fertile ground, ensuring my legacy would generate tangible generational knowledge instead of funding a parasitic cycle of suburban greed. Dozens of local children raced across the newly paved recreation courtyard, their joyous laughter cutting cleanly through the humid tropical air. They chased a worn soccer ball under the brilliant morning sun, completely unburdened by the complex, ruthless adult world operating around them. I leaned against the sturdy chain-link fence, watching their unfiltered happiness. I thought about the bitter, freezing night I pushed that heavy oak dresser against my broken bedroom door to protect myself from my own flesh and blood. The stark contrast between that suffocating hostility and this vibrant community illuminated a brutal, necessary truth. Society relentlessly conditions us to believe that biological connections represent an unbreakable sacred covenant. We are taught to endure unimaginable disrespect, financial exploitation, and emotional abuse simply because the predator shares our genetic code. Damon had weaponized that exact societal expectation. He assumed my unconditional love as a black father would act as a permanent blind shield against his monstrous greed. He was entirely incorrect. I realized that blood merely dictates the starting point of a relationship. It absolutely does not guarantee loyalty, respect, or fundamental human decency. True loyalty is forged through mutual sacrifice and sustained by consistent, honorable actions. Damon had consciously chosen to sever our biological bond the exact second he prioritized his white brother-in-law's fraudulent scams over my vital heart medication. Walking away from a toxic bloodline is not an act of selfish abandonment. It is a profound, necessary act of self-preservation. I refused to let societal guilt anchor me to a sinking ship piloted by a man who actively planned to lock me in a psychiatric ward. I had surgically amputated a gangrenous limb to save the rest of the body. Bradley stood beside me at the fence, quietly observing the thriving community center. He extended his hand, offering a firm, respectful grip, before heading back to the local airstrip to return to his high-rise office in the city. He had executed the financial extraction flawlessly, honoring the debt he owed my late best friend. I watched his black vehicle kick up a cloud of white dust as it disappeared down the coastal road. I turned my back on the street and walked slowly down to the pristine shoreline. The warm, crystal-clear water washed gently over the toes of my heavy leather work boots. I looked out at the endless, unbroken blue horizon. The ultimate payoff of my entire orchestration finally crystallized in my mind. The true victory was not the devastating federal indictments hanging over Damon and Megan. It was not the padlocked gym doors or the spectacular public repossession of their luxury lifestyle. Those were simply the necessary, mechanical consequences of their own malicious arrogance. My true revenge was the profound, untouchable peace I had finally secured for my own soul. I had successfully reclaimed my dignity, my resources, and my absolute independence. I no longer had to eat what I was given. I no longer had to shrink myself to fit inside a freezing, windowless storage room. I was a master builder who had completely demolished a corrupted structure and cleared the debris to build something beautiful. I took a deep, steadying breath of the salt-heavy air, feeling my strong heart beating steadily in my chest. The silent adjustment was officially complete. The mid-morning sun beats down relentlessly on the construction site in the center of the village. I stand near the edge of the freshly dug trenches, breathing in the familiar heavy scent of wet concrete and turned earth. A crew of local men maneuvers a heavy steel rebar grid into place. I watch their coordinated movements with deep satisfaction. I spent 45 years managing structural loads in the brutal Chicago rail yards. I know exactly what a solid foundation looks like. A structure will only survive if the materials are tested and the ground is properly prepared. I made a catastrophic engineering error with my son. I poured $400,000 of pure, unearned capital directly into Damon's hands. I wanted to shield him from the racial and economic hardships I faced as a young black man in America. I wanted his path to be entirely smooth. I believed my immense financial sacrifice would automatically generate gratitude and character. That was the most dangerous lie a father could ever tell himself. I did not build a strong foundation for my son. I built a glass house on top of a swamp. Unearned wealth does not build character. It acts as an accelerant for inherent greed. Damon never felt the agonizing burn in his lower back from working a double shift to keep the lights on. He never had to calculate the cost of a single gallon of gas. I handed him an empire, and he immediately treated the crown as his absolute birthright. He surrounded himself with parasites like his white brother-in-law Logan and his vain wife Megan. He valued their hollow high society approval over the literal heartbeat of the man who funded his entire existence. My ultimate lesson was forged in the freezing darkness of that windowless storage room. I learned that blind paternal loyalty is a fatal weakness. Society demands that we forgive our bloodlines unconditionally. Society expects us to endure profound disrespect simply because we share a genetic code with our abusers. I reject that expectation entirely. A biological connection is a starting point. It is not a lifetime contract for indentured servitude. Respect must be continuously earned and boundaries must be ruthlessly enforced. When I triggered the fail-safe clause and drained the corporate accounts to absolute zero, I stopped being a victim. I became the architect of my own salvation. I severed the diseased branch to save the rest of the tree. The local children running past the construction site today are the true beneficiaries of that harsh adjustment. I am utilizing my reclaimed wealth to construct an advanced vocational academy for this village. I am teaching these young men and women the intricate mathematics of structural engineering. I am providing them with the exact tools they need to build their own futures. I am not simply handing them cash. They are laying the bricks. They are pouring the concrete. They are earning their legacy through physical labor and intellectual dedication. This academy will stand for a century because the people building it fundamentally respect the materials. Damon lost his empire in a matter of hours because he never respected the architect. I sit back in my rattan chair and take a slow sip of my premium local coffee. The tropical air is perfectly warm, the distant ocean horizon remains crystal clear, and my resilient mind is entirely at peace. I successfully survived the absolute ultimate betrayal, reclaimed my stolen dignity, and methodically engineered a beautiful, highly secure new reality for my twilight years. Did my story resonate with you? I want to hear your thoughts. Have you ever been forced to cut off a toxic family member to protect your own peace and dignity? Tell me exactly how you handled the situation in the comments section below. Let me know which city or country you are watching this video from today. Your support allows me to share these vital lessons with the world. Please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more powerful stories of survival and justice. The strongest structures are built together. Thank you for listening to my journey today, and always remember to firmly know your true worth.